Okay. These are forward added to the text because the post translator feels that this is needed to give the power its meaning. ثم what did he do? الحقيقة السيار made a mistake in his translation. شوف الكلمة عفوا قبل هاي number 3 you came by on bamboo stilts. البامبو هي الخيزران شلون خيزران الوقت من النوع الاصلي والستلتس هي هذه الخشبتين اللي الواحد يستخدمها اثناء اللعب او اثناء ما يمشون دول الموكين يمشون مكان شوي بدون عالي. These are the stilts. This is a kind of game used in Britain يلعبونها الاطفال خاصه البويز. ماذا تجسد؟ السيارة ترجم العضلات الستونز دكتور how long is the talk give me? How many minutes it was out?
Already finished.
Please give me 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, doctor. خلاص. شوف السيارة ما لها ترجم البامبو ستونز اللي هي again in Britain ترجمها عضلات زانا. This is what? This is localization. إضفاء الصبغة المحلية على الترجمة. It's a game اللي هو الخصيب اللي مثل القصبة أريد and used by horse just like a horse يركضون حصان يركض. شوف there is a common feature صفة مشتركة between the two but it is totally different. The stilt is totally different from عضلات زانا. فاستخدم المايكرو استراتيجي اللي هي of substitution of adaptation كيف النص إلى الصبغة المحلية not only Iraqi but local اللي هي لغة خصية so that people can understand it. فاستخدم المايكرو استراتيجي للسياق to change the text. أذكركم ما أخطر like this. I have another example but it's almost the same. So the main conclusion is that what? Translating poetry is something which is really very hard. It's not easy. One needs to be creative. One needs to make a lot of effort. We have to use these strategies. Translation can help us in the translation process. And in fact, to end, Edmund Carey mentions some distinguished translations. لأن البعض يقولون it is impossible to translate poetry. لكن عندنا أمثلة of translated poets from different parts of the world, like what? Like Goethe or Manishrigo, Mallarmé فرنسا، لما جوا روسيا، ودير فرنسا، Pasternak روسيا، Aragon فرنسا، Azerbaijan and many others who produced masterpieces in translation. And thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Razu.
Arabic, but they are closely related to the theme of my paper. So, this is the first video. It's
وإذا عمل وجهها اليوم فهو متابع فقط النافذة اليوم. أقول بكم مشاهد
التي هي فصيل القاعدة. كانت تستضيف هذه المصادر.
مشروع مشروع شخصي باللغة العربية متضمن الثورة التكتيكية وبالتوضيح من مصطلحات الأخبار لحدثها وأولوية تفاصيل الكلمة والحرف والنفس في كل مناسبة محددة.
هذا البرنامج كان جالس في اسطنبول وتستضيف القناة العربية السعودية ويشارك الملايين من الناس.
يعترفون بشأن العربية المخاطب المكتشفة حقيقة مناسبة لغير لغة الشعب. تعتبر العربية أداة للتحليل العالمي ومن الحديثين كما يقرأ
لكن الشيء المهم في الموضوع هو أن القناة العربية التي تعتبر غرفة عملية لتوجيه هذا العمل المكاني قد نشرت الخبر قبل حدوثه.
من داخل بحث الضوئي وتوسط الأمن تشكل الجاسرين معركة الدولي مع المتمردين عليه وتذكر معركة الشخصية عندما يبدو مع العربية. المحتوى العربية.
So, as you can see, there is a cold war between two socio-political parties, here represented by Arabic, and its sponsor, of course, Saudi Arabia, and the Syrian government. For this war, whether it is physical or even conceptual, there are agents. Those agents are influenced by the socio-political opinions, let's say motivations, interests of sponsors. Now let's move to something to translation. Salah.
Yesterday, the special envoy seemed to say that he was 100% satisfied with the sector of Syria, and how do these pressures impact the Syrian Arab Republic delegation?
شفت المترجمة شفت الشغل شفت المترجمة صراحة
Connected your statement by referring to the capital instead of referring to a regime which was the original word used by the Germans.
احنا بنريد الى هنا اسمنا
The title of our delegation is the delegation of the Syrian Arab Republic. Are you going to correct that title?
احنا نقلنا نفس الملاحظات للميستر وقلنا له يمكن هذا المصطلح الى الناس.
And we conveyed that position to the special envoy and we told them that such terminology should not be allowed.
So as you can see that the interpreter intervened in the process. Here there are more than one perspective that we can, let's say, from which we can approach this, let's say, ideological war. First of all, as you know, from ethical perspective, interpreters and translators are advised, are not allowed to intervene, to modify the messages. From the other side, here the interpreter works for certain organization and she or he has to stick to the, let's say, codes of ethics, let's say, or codes of whatever that are established by that particular institution. So, we can say that translators and interpreters can consciously or subconsciously intervene in order to what? To be the weapons, the tools that represent, that reflect the ideologies of their sponsor. And this is really the main idea that my paper addresses. The research hypothesis is that because of the sociological term translation and interpreting, translators and interpreters are no more looked at as innocent, let's say, linguistic or cultural mediators. They intervene, whether consciously or subconsciously, in order to feed the knowledge and beliefs of their organizations or their sponsors. Here examples are taken from the Arab meaning. These ideas brings us to another, let's say, area. Mr. Hashim talked about the translators as transcreators. This is the positive side. The perspective from which I address, I deal with that particular problem is that they are new. They can be agents who can employ, who can fulfill, achieve, whether willingly or unwillingly, the let's say the interest of their sponsors, so they can delete, add, or replace the messages that they can deliver. As you know, translators are labeled as linguistic or cultural mediators. They are also called creators. They are called coordinators. But there is the other side that I have just mentioned, is that they can be ideological subverters. They can be the tools through which certain ideologies, certain, let's say, doctrines, trends are reflected to the audience throughout what? Throughout the modifications of the messages. Of course, if the audience is bilingual, they can distinguish, they can identify occasions of intervention, and they can know that the interpreter or translator has been faithful or not. But as you know, in the Middle East, the Arab audience are monolingual. So we take the messages conveyed by the channels as taken for granted. We don't negotiate, particularly if these are, let's say, delivered by العلمية and Al Jazeera. There is another example here. For example, Donald Trump in the Gulf Cooperation Council attaches on putting Hezbollah on the list of terrorist organizations. But the Al Jazeera interpreter intervenes and what adds, as you can see, وحزب الله طبعا منظمة إرهابية. This sentence, this piece of information has not been conveyed by the speaker, but it has been, let's fed into the utterances by whom? By the interpreter. Of course, I repeat, this process will be conscious or subconscious. But what does this mean? This means that because of the exposure to the interests of our sponsors, of our organizations, we will be the tools throughout the ideologies that can subvert, that can be the tools of war going against the other. Here we depend on active network theory to justify such behaviors. Within active network theory, the texts and evidences are treated as negotiations of ideas, where the agents or actors and the structure, the network, are in interchangeable relationships. So, starting with the sponsor, for example, there are four stage, let's say, process throughout which the sponsors, the ideological, let's say, personal, try to the first of all, problematization, in which they establish themselves as a status, that we are the representatives of such socio-political group. Then the interestment that this is what is in our benefit and that is what is against us. The third one is enrollment, in which the focal actors, such as translators and interpreters, indulge in such negotiations. And the last stage is mobilization, in which translators and interpreters try to perform depending on what? Depending on the ideologies or the socio-political trends that they have been exposed to. So this is what justifies the performance of translators and interpreters if they are acting as ideological subverters. There are also other examples you are familiar with. For example, if Daesh is mentioned, if you listen to Al Jazeera, you will find the الإسلامية. If Gulf states are mentioned, they try to generalize, for example, الاقتصادات. And there are some examples that we can look at, but we don't have time. We move to the conclusions. Here, the first conclusion is that we need to look at translators and interpreters from, let's say, a less positive perspective or from a negative perspective. They are particularly at zones of conflict where there are wars, there are, for example, ideological conflicts. When they participate, their role becomes more active, and also it will be more influential, because the ideas that will be diverted or influence the audience. The other conclusion is that we are no more bridging gaps. We can participate in these wars, act as agents of wars. And of course, for that there are certain consequences. Translations and interpreters offered by Arab media should not be looked as transparent and let's say honest. Of course, this has been approached from different angles or from these different perspectives, but the idea here is that the term ideological subverter to be added to the vocabulary, the negative vocabulary that is describing the translator on the top. Besides spies, coordinators, translators, and so on. There are certain consequences, such as we need to replan our training programs, establishment of monitoring institutions that can, let's say, dispose such occasions to our audience, and of course, the emphasis should be put on the strategies such as addition, deletion, and replacement that translators and interpreters follow in their approach. And thank you very much for your listening.
Dr. Jassim has done a number of papers on Al Jazeera, so he's a Jazeera man by now. وتحقيقه للمرتبة الأولى على صعيد أقسام الترجمة في الجامعات العراقية ضمن التصنيف الوطني للجودة. حياكم الله وأهلا وسهلا بكم. يسعدنا ويسرنا اليوم أن نبدأ المؤتمر بورقة بحثية لأستاذنا الأستاذ هاشم غازم الذي ترجم شعرا وكتب رسالة عن الشعر، وهو اليوم يقدم ورقة بحثية بعنوان The Translational Poetry, Faithful Translation or Transcreation. So, Mr. Razin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carlos, the Chairman, for your introduction. Before going to my paper, I would like to say a few words in Arabic. Excuse me. في هذا المؤتمر أقدم جزيل الشكر والامتنان لحضور السيد رئيس الجامعة المحترم والسيد أمين كلية الآداب المحترم، وإلى الأستاذة زينب رئيسة المؤتمر واللجنة التحليلية التي يعني أدت إلى أن يصبح هذا المؤتمر حقيقة قائمة. وأهنئ قسم الترجمة وهو قسمي الأصل، قسمي المؤتمر على التميز الذي حصل عليه، وهذا شيء أفتخر به. My paper is titled Translating English Poetry into Arabic. Is it faithful translation or translation? Ladies and gentlemen, you all know that poetry has a very ancient history. It's not something new. It is associated with the history of human mind because it is basically an expression of people's emotions, sentiments, sensations, feelings, and whatever other things. But then it got really complicated, and that's why when the translation movement started in the world, people, especially Arabs, didn't touch translating poetry because they felt it is so hard to translate. And because of that, in fact, we have different views on the translation of poetry into Arabic or into other languages. It is really a contentious and controversial issue. قضية مختلف عليها. So we have, for example, the proponents, people who supported, people who favored translating poetry into other languages, but also they differed Because one group said we have to translate that into what? Into prose only. Because prose can be easily written, and prose can express the thoughts, ideas, points of view, insights of the original author. But when it is translated into poetry, now everything is lost. Everything is lost. Possibly the musical effect or the sound effect is returned. Right. The opponents to this view said it's impossible. They believe in the impossibility of the translatability of poetry into other languages, starting with Jahil in the 9th century, who said that it's impossible to translate Arabic poetry into other languages or get other poetry of other nations into Arabic, because it will lose its essence. يفقد جوهره. So it can't be. Then we have the views of others, like the famous American poet, Robert Frost, who defined poetry as such. Robert Frost said, poetry is what is yet lost in translation. Poetry is what is yet lost in translation. We have also Jacobson, who also a linguist, who said, when poetry is translated into other language, even into poetry, it will lose its identity. It will be another form totally different. That's why, in fact, people who translate poetry face a lot of hardships and difficulties indeed. It is because of the nature of poetry itself. Because poets tend to choose their words, even word items, vocabulary items, very carefully. We have the term poetic diction, and because of figurative language, because of the cadence and modulations and musicality used in the poem, and maybe others, punning, plain words, and other features. This makes the task, the duty of the translator of poetry really very terrible. I faced it, Dr. Carl tried, he faced it, and other people who tried to translate poetry into other languages should have faced such a problem. So we need to get help from other maybe branches, from knowledge, from other things. Now, in this paper, I try to borrow the term transcreation, transcreation. And transcreation is a term merged from two, translation and creation, al-ibda', creativity. So this is what we need in the translation. We have to be creative. We have to be highly creative. Just to give you an idea of what is transcreation, it is a term that appeared in the 60s and 70s of the last century. It didn't appear for literature at all. It was a result of the technological and scientific breakthroughs and developments in the world. And it was really invented, coined for a commercial purpose. For what? Advertising, مجالات الإعلام, and for marketing, التسويق والإعلان, both related to commerce, التجارة, and also for the flourishing video industry. They needed what we call promotion and publicizing, الترويج للمنتجات من الفيديوز. And then came industry like cars, foods. يعني when McDonald's wants to have a branch in Baghdad or in Basra or India, they need to promote their product. So they have already, let us say, video, and this should be translated in Arabic. Should this be translated? It is originally addressing the American audience, people who are coming to restaurants. So when this branch is opened in Iraq, should we follow the same cultural, American cultural traits? Definitely the answer is no. So we have to do something in Arabic. We have to make certain changes, or at least adaptations to cope with the new audience. This kind of change, dictated by translation, is called micro-strategies. Micro-strategies, including things like adaptation, paraphrase, deletion, addition, condensation, and others. Sometimes the translated text or video is a totally different piece from the original text. Totally different. But it should address the same objective. and تحقق الهدف and know the words. ولذلك عندنا الآن مصطلح creator and not translator. العاملون في هذا الحقل are called translators and they are really highly paid. They are highly paid. So there is a lot of money waiting for translators who come to the translation area. Yes, because translation means not only efficient and proficient translation only. It needs creativity, creative mind, creative ability of writing. It needs you to make a lot of research in the field. You need to consult other people who are specialized in the field so that you come with information. So you spend a lot of time. You are not only translating. See? Then some of the elements of the characteristics of translation could be taken by what translators of literature, especially translators of what translators of poetry. For this, in fact, we need at least an example to illustrate the point I have just mentioned, and I have chosen a poem translated by التي into Arabic. You know, before I go to the poem, many people say, and scholars say, that nobody can translate poetry, only poets can translate poetry into what? Into poetry. Only poets, because they can feel the language. But on one condition, that those poets should be fluent in the language. And التي has the BA in English. خريج دار المعلمين العالي معروف في بغداد. And he is a pioneering, a great poet, Arabic poet. So his English is excellent, his poetic creativity is high, so when he translates, he's different from Hashim Ghazi. See, I'm not a poet, he's a poet. Well, that his translation, we expect it to be what? A little bit different. The poem he translated is أزرقان. كان معجب بأزرقان وذي أسئلة السياق. كان معجب بإليت وأستاذه أزرقان. بالمناسبة أزرقان has done a great job in translating poetry by translating Chinese poetry into English. He translated Chinese poetry into English. But surprisingly, he didn't know Chinese at all. He depended on translators, Chinese and others, and British, who knew Chinese very well, so they translated the poems almost literally into English. And then he recast, he rendered that into what? Into English. And the result was what? Really, for some people they wrote masterpieces. Translations of what? Masterpieces done by a famous scholar like Ezra Pound. This poem is The River Merchant's Wife, a letter. Ezra Pound's poem is The River Merchant's Wife, letter, and here is here. I have chosen only the first stanza of the poem. I'm going to read it. How the pound, while my hair was still cut straight across my parrot, I played about the front gate, pulling flowers. You came by on bamboo stilts, playing horse. You walked about my seat, playing with blue plums. And we went on living in the village of Chokan, two small people, without dislike or suspicion. This is the first stanza by Ezra Pound, شاعر كبير. كيف ترجم السياق هذه القصيدة الفرقان؟ قد كان شعري هذا السياق، قد كان شعري قد كان شعري ما يزال شعري الشعر، قد كان because I have little hair. قد كان شعري ما يزال يقص خطا مستقيما على الجبين أيام ذاك، وكنت عند الباب ألعب بالزهور، وكنت تأتي راكبا على ذات حزان الوهم صيرها حصان، قد كنت تنظر حيث أجلس أو تدور حول المكان، وكان بين يديك من ريش الطيور زرق لعبت بها كثار، كنا نعيش كخير ما عاش الورى في شوكان، طفلين لا كرها نحس ولا شككنا كالكبار. Read this. I feel that I'm reading Sayyid. حقيقة I'm not reading as a pound. السياد تفريها يعني كلام السياد touch is there in the poem. حاول يترجمها poetic يعني ولذلك عند الراعي موجودة although it is intermittent متقطعة بالزهور على الجبين على باتوزاني حصاني بالزهور أو تدوري. الراعي القافي لاحظ القافي اللي يحاول يخليها السياق القصيدة الطيور أو تدور الطيور اللي من الإسلام ترايم اللي هي القافية الجزئية كثار الطيور كثار في شوكان وأنهاها كالكبار. فحاول يطلب هذا رايم in the translated form. بالنثر this is absent. هذا مفقود في النثر. السياق حاول ليس نستخدم المايكرو strategies we said that have to be used in the translation. ومنها مثلا الاديشن. فقد أضاف كلمات مثل أيام ذاك اللي هي لاين نمبر 3 أيام ذاك. أضاف كلمة الوهم، أضاف كلمة الوهم، وأضاف كلمة كثار زرق لعبت بها كثار. فإذا هاي الكلمات لاين نمبر 3 أيام ذاك، لاين نمبر 5 الوهم، لاين نمبر 7 زرق لعبت بها كثار. هذه الكلمة وكذلك كلمة الكبار last word in the stanza هاي 4 كلمات these are not used in the what؟ شوي
والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين محمد وعلى آله وصحبه المنجين. My research today entitled أهمية تكوين الكفاءة الاحترافية للمترجم في الكشف عن مشاكل الترجمة. The importance of forming translator's professional competence in reviewing translation problems, and this is highly in fact related to the topic raised by our instructor, Mr. Hasha. Okay, so starting with the abstract. Professionalism in the work of translator is manifested primarily in the quality of the activity, and here I'd like to underline the word quality, the quality of the personality. And the question that I'd like to ask to Dr. Jassim, but the end of the session comes and interrupted the question, is about the importance of being neutral when translating. Is it possible for translators? Is it possible for translators to be neutral? And I think this matter is impossible, because we are all, in fact, affected by our socio-cultural background while translating, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Okay, so the quality of personality, that's to say personality, and the question here, does personality matter in translation? And I think the answer is yes. Being decisive. You know, when we translate, of course we, in fact, select and we choose. And when we come to the search for any word, in fact, we see a number of words. If we go back to the word get, we will see that there are more than 35 meanings for the word get, and which one to choose. So being, I think, decisive is important. And the importance of being a problem solver at the same time. Because the translation process is a process of making decisions. Okay. So this study reports that in the process of building professional competence, the translators are creating a peculiar linguistic personality, which differs from the usual presence of certain competences or components. And Kamisarov, 2002, relates to such competences. That's to say, in addition to the linguistic competence, translators need to, in fact, form or build other competences, and that's why I always focus in my lecture and transfer this idea for my students, because most of our students consider translation process as what? As a linguistic process. And in fact, the process of translation goes far beyond conversion of language level. Kamisarov relates to such competences, linguistic competence. So linguistic competence is one of the pillars of translation process, but is not the only one. It is one of the competences that translators require to acquire in order to do their work successfully. Communicative, and even the work of translator doesn't include only one activity. The translator's work combines, in fact, a variety of activities. One of these activities is linguistic activity, communicative activity, mediation activity. Without these and other like activities. So according to Kamisarov, he relates other competences to the linguistic one to translate successfully. So the first one is linguistic, communicative, text forming, and that is what has Mr. Ashton referred to. Technical competences. Now, who can deny, in fact, the role of technology in our life, and what technology does to translate nowadays. Particularly CAT programs. CAT programs, in fact, help to build the technical competence of the translator. So as well as special personal characteristics. As you say, personality matters in translation. Moral and ethical competence. As instructors, do we teach or train our students to be ethical and moral when translating? This is a question. Due to this creation of certain types of competences and skills included in translators' professional competence. So it is an overall translator professional competence is an overall competence. It has what? It has sub-competences. Professionalism in his work when, according to Mr. Roth, when the translators be able to acquire, in addition to the linguistic competence, communicative competence, text forming competence, technical competence, special personal characteristics competence, moral and ethical competence. When these, let's say, competences be acquired by the translator, he will be able to do his work successfully and perfectly. And by the way, there is no perfect translation at all, as I believe. So introduction, the professional competence of the translator necessarily includes some personality characteristics, without which he will not be able to successfully perform his professional function. Translation is a complex type of mental activity, the implementation of which requires a special mental organization, its great plasticity and flexibility. And here is our work. Being flexible is very important as far as translation is required. And even openness to others is one of the key tasks in translation process. Without the openness, I think clashes would be clashes between cultures, of course, will So being openness to others is one of the main tasks of translation. Without it, clashes between culture will be taken place, will be happened. The ability to quickly switch attention, that's to say, to have full attention, move from one language to another, from one culture to another at the same time, from one communicative situation to another, and all these matters are not linguistic. I think all being touched. The translator is required to be able
for this introduction. My topic is entitled Arabic Complex Predicates in terms of their grammaticalization and semantic impact. upon the process of the translation into English. Before I head on shifting and going through this topic, grammaticalization is something which means a kind of a grammatical change regarding the content words, shifting them into grammatical words or what is called function words. Semantic impact is something usual. So this paper, this is the abstract, this paper examines the grammaticalization and semantic impacts of Arabic complex predicates, plus their renderings into English. The methodology, again, which is a very important step in doing any research. It is a kind of a plan without which you cannot go through your topic or your research paper. You know that well-written papers should be methodologically well qualified. As far as my topic is concerned, my methodology is or includes Rappaport, Ubab, and Levin, and their approach concerning the types of verbs in English, concerning unaccusative verbs, unergated verbs, light verbs, and serial verbs. The data in this paper includes various Quranic verses that encapsulate Arabic complex structures and how they are rendered into English. The results of my research paper show that Arabic, being a very rich language in its morphological system, shows different verb meanings, of course, plus the ones that have been arrived at by other researchers. So, in conclusion, Arabic is rich in its verb systems, so translators are entitled, or they are in a position to grasp the structures and meanings of these complex verbs. So in Arabic, and we have well-qualified researchers in Arabic language, find out that the meanings, the basic meanings that have been conveyed by such structures include approximation, wishful thinking, and action initiation. In Arabic, we call them af'al shuru'. Now, let me say something about complex predicates and what are they. They are usually defined as predicates which are multi-headed, and when we say that a construction is multi-headed, it means that it contains more than one element, whether a verb, an adjective, and a noun, and sometimes there are particles included. And we are going to see in one of the examples that one of the particles in Arabic can convey a kind of meaning that is similar to a verb. So not even words. Maybe there are morphemes that can fulfill this function. So each of which, I mean here whether a morpheme or a word, contributes part of the information that ordinarily is associated with a head. And this is supported by Müller, who is a German scholar. The predicate information of the constituents merges where they have common conceptual structure. This means that what is important is the conceptual structure of discourse structure. We do not focus on, for instance, on the verb itself. We need the elements that combine with such verbs in order to arrive at the conceptual structure, and after that we are going to gain or acquire the meaning that can be conveyed by such structures. Complex predicates in English, they include serial verbs like verbs, particle plus verb, and sometimes verb plus particle. A simple example is they carried on a conversation. As you can see in this example, we have a verb which is carried, when we have a preposition, or sometimes it is called a particle, plus a noun. All of these together, I mean the verb plus the preposition plus the noun following it, all of these constitute what is called one conceptual structure, and we are in a position to get the meaning of this together in order to do what? In order to translate properly. Conversation here, it is marked as a deverbal noun. Deverbal nouns, sometimes they are called nominalizations, and this topic is of fashion nowadays because scholars, especially in doing discourse analysis projects, have focused on this topic, which is nominalization, so it is significant. A short word about the model given by Aqqam to the They identify the major empirical issues that are addressed by theories of argument realization, and present and discuss the theoretical proposals that have been made to account for these issues. Plus, they have focused on, as I have mentioned, on the difference between unaccusative verbs and aggregative verbs. Aggregated verb is what? It is active in form, a verb which is active in form, but in meaning it is passive. For instance, when I say the door opens, the door opens, as far as the structure is concerned, it is active. But when you want to render it, you do what? You should grasp the meaning plus the structure. So we say in Arabic, al-babu ينفتح or يفتح. ينفتح in Arabic is a verb which is called أفعال المطاوعة in Arabic. The same, so we have a kind of structure which is similar to ergative verbs in English, which is called what? أفعال المطاوعة. And by the way, there is a difference between a passive verb and an ergative verb. Yes, the meaning is passive, I mean in the ergative verb sense, but the intention differs. For instance, in the Holy Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala يقول وَانْفَجَرَتْ مِنْهُ 12 عَيْنًا, انفجرت, it is what? On the form of انفعل, which is an ergative verb, I mean من أفعال المطاوعة, which means simultaneous action. It is not intended, unlike the passive one. I'm not going to take time focusing on the difference between an-ergatives and accusative. Just see this. An accusative verb is that verb which have only one theme. You know what is meant by theme. What is a theme? A theme here is the affected participants. You know, this model focuses on arguments, and I think Dr. Muhammad is well acquainted with this topic. Arguments regard what? Regard the participants that are involved in the action of the sentence. Aggregatives are verbs that have only one agent, and you know that the agent is the doer of the action. In the literature review, I have focused on various studies, especially from Arabic ones. Of course, Dr. Fadl al-Samarai is a prominent figure in this regard. He has examined these types of verbs, and I have followed him concerning the meanings given by wishful thinking, approximation, and initiation. Other scholars, due to the shortage of time, I'm going to skip them. You know, to do a cross-linguistic study, you need to consult other studies regarding other languages. And these are the results of these studies, Bararuba and Bart, who examined the Urdu language. Now, discussion and results. So, Arabic complex constructions give different shades of meanings. By doing what? By using different structures from the same domain. So translators should be aware of these nuances and the behavior of such verbs, especially regarding their grammaticalization. Now, let us see this example, and we are going to see the difference. And then I go to two Quranic verses. كاد زيد أن يموت. And the second version is كاد زيد يموت. The difference regarding the structure, it is quite clear. The first one, we have the particle an, which is one of the particles that make the Arabic verb accusative. So what is the function of this particle? Let us compare. Out of the translation, كاد زيد أن يموت, this particle gives the meaning of distant proximity. So the action is not near, it is not close to us, it is distant, or let's say it is far. Due to what? Due to the presence of this particle. So again, and going in line with Rappaport and letting their approach, particles can function just like verbs sometimes. So translators should pay attention to this issue. But if we delete the article and, what we are going to get? We are going to get a very different perspective in which we see that we are focusing on near proximity, and this should be reflected in the translation process. As you can see, of course these are my attempts and they are not exclusive. May be there are people who have different translations. And the first one, Zayd was about to die, and the second one, Zayd was on the point of dying. And when I went through the meaning of on the point of, I have found out this expression gives the meaning of near proximity. That's why I felt myself in a position to use this as an equivalent to it. Now, subtraction. Now, let me go on. What's your opinion? Shall I go on or stop? Let me go to the Quran verses. فَذَبَحُوهَا وَمَا كَانُوا يَفْعَلُونَ. Of course, this is in Surah Al-Baqarah. كَادَ plus another verb, which is يَفْعَل. This is a complex predicate. And sometimes they call it serial verbs. Why? Because كاد is a verb, يفعل is another verb, so it is a complex predicate. One of the translations, this is in the International Sahih, this is the translation. the attempt is so they slaughtered her. You know, فذبحوها, and her refers to al-Baqarah. And in their society, in their culture, they respect, such kinds of animals, using what is called in literature personification. So they say, but I don't think in the Arabic society we do the same, unfortunately. But they could hardly do it. As you can see, the English equivalent is what is an adverb, which is hardly. This is for what? For kade, which is a verb in Arabic. The other one, وَرَفَقَا يَخْسِفَانَ عَلَيْهُمَا مِنْ وَرَقِ الْجَنَّةِ. This is a verb of what? Of initiation. Tafiqa, sorry, is a verb, which is followed by another verb, which is in what? In the present form. There is a point in Arabic, there is a point which should be taken into consideration, that when we have two verbs in a given sentence, the tense of that sentence depends on the first verb. Although the second verb is in the present form, it is what going to be translated as in the past. Why? Because Arabic is a language which depends on the first verb to arrive at what? At the tense. By the way, what is meant by a light verb? A light verb is that verb which shows the contrast of tense, voice, mood, and things that are related to what? To the category of a verb. Here I have used two translations. One of them is from the International Sahih, the other one is from Al-Hilali and Muhsin Khan. And you can see the difference between the two translations. The first one, they began to fasten. Began to fasten is a complex predicate in English. Why? Because you have two verbs. The meaning of fasten together, here the translator tries to arrive at the meaning of tafiqa. And the second one, they have used a different lexical verb, which is covered. So, in a nutshell, translators should take into consideration the conceptual structure of such verbs in order to arrive at the intended meaning of the writer or of the speaker. And I don't want to take long. Thank you very much for your listening. And I am listening if there is a question, and of course they are welcome. Thank you very much.
Resume our conference in its second day. The first session will be virtual, and we will have two speakers. Dr. Muhammad Kazim from Al-Mustansiri University, and Assistant Professor Ali Hamada Miglid from University of Mosul. We will start with Dr. Muhammad Kazim, currently the head of the Department of Translation, College of Art, University, Mustansiri University. His general specialty is translation and linguistics. His master's thesis is entitled Postmodernism and Popular Culture. His doctoral thesis is entitled Assessing the Translating English Sports Language into Arabic. The title of his talk is Modal Verbs and Legal Translation with reference to the translation of Iraqi informatics crime law. So, Dr. Muhammad, if you are ready, we are pleased. Yes. The floor is yours, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jas. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. Indeed, I should first start by thanking and expressing my gratitude to the University of Basra and to course, special thanks to Dr. Zainab, the head of the translation department, and thank you for you, the moderator, Dr. Jackson, my old friend. Well, as you've stated, Dr. Jackson, that the title of my paper is Model Verb Legal Translation, reference to the translation of the Iraqi pragmatics framework. And indeed, you know, it's a fact beyond dispute that legal language is a kind of obtrusive, complex language. Of course, when it comes to translation between the two languages, English and Arabic, all of us know the fact that both belong to two remote cultures, and both languages are rooted in two different linguistic systems. So this very fact would, of course, present a lot of challenges and issues. Well, actually, first of course, I try to stick to time. I know time is sticking, so I will try to give the synopsis of the paper, and hopefully we will share with you in writing as the timeline set by you. Well, the paper aims to investigate the role of modal expressions in both Arabic and English legal texts. As you know, modal verbs have distinguished place within legal English since the way it became the very function of legal language. That is obligation, permission. So this is an attempt to see and incorporate quantitative along with the quantitative descriptive approach by applying the chosen data. That is to say, of course, the architects of legal document, namely the informatics crime law in Iraq, along and whether the draft has been taken from the Iraqi Council of Representatives, with its translations that was done by an institution called the Free World Word Center. And this will be the case study of this paper, just to highlight the similarities and the differences between the two languages. Indeed, this case study takes its data from the Iraqi, as I said, from the Iraqi Council of Representatives, which is the Nawab al-Iraqi, and it is the informatics crime law and the translation. So we're trying to make a sort of comparison and contrast the two texts and see where the gaps lie in the translation. The data is a process with fullness software, namely a word to measure the accuracy of each item and its concordance with the neighboring text. With all of the studies to measure the frequency of the use of modality in both texts, in addition to observing the strategies used to translate them. Both qualitative and quantitative approaches were adopted in order to have a clear insight into this objective. Well, actually, I know this is a small size of corpus, so the small size of the corpus and the limitation of time may not confirm the generalization of the results. Yet, it is still helpful in providing, I would say, a viewpoint about, the translation, the legal translation of this text into English. Indeed, the Arabic text is divided into four main parts: definitions and goals, the punitive provisions, procedures for collecting evidence, investigation and trial, and the general regulations and conclusions are. And I'm going to read, of course, out the conclusion part, just the time allows. The first part is rendered with clear language, the exception of the use of as such, or of any legal specialized expressions. So we know this is undoubtedly there is a general consensus of the fact that sometimes we call very technical language, technical when we do it vice versa. So, for example, in Arabic, I will just give general examples. In Arabic, we have, for example, al-shart wal-mushar. This is very technical, but it is translated to English. Example, just clause and agreement. Clause and agreement, which are almost ordinary language used by lay people. So this, kind of process between the two languages is reflected also in the translation of this book. The first part, I told you, it is under clear language because of it is, about preamble and issues like that. The second part resorts mainly to the past form. So we have here yu'ad, and we have only 8 instances of the verb and a post-nominalization. So it would be like this: تكون العقوبة. While the translated text heavily depends on the use of the modal shall. I think all of you know the modal shall. This, of course, obligatory sense and has the obligation function shall in the legal language. The third part, it is actually aiming at instructional procedures. Some forms of modals we can detect from scans, such as يجوز, and some would prefer also to use يحق, لا يحق. So the first, the third or the council, the organization may, you would say يحق للمنظمة لها الحق أو يجوز. So we use that in Arabic. So and also here, as you can hear, we use the unfortunately I didn't share the PowerPoint presentation for the paper. However, I assume that you can hear me loud and clear. The use, here we see the use of the particle le in Arabic, as in the al-tahiyya, or the verbal forms of such as يتولى التحقيق. Here actually the translated text also shows rather rare use of modals other than shall. With one instance for could, 2 instances for can, may, and there are recorded 5 utterances with, of course, might and shall. The general use of shall in legal texts denote, as I said, obligation and prohibitions, as is the case in this text. So we say, for example, here, the organization shall. Sometimes we translate this into يقوم, تقوم المنظمة, تقوم الدائرة. Some would prefer to reflect the obligation clearly. So they would say على المنظمة, يجب على الدائرة, something like that. So, and while with may, as I've just mentioned, we might use يحق, يجوز, يمكن. As I also promised from the very beginning, I will not be too long, so I may jump into sharing with you some of the conclusions that the study has arrived at. Well, actually, models as an integral part of the legal discourse are used to implement very objective of the legal language that is said to represent aspects of obligation, prohibition, permission, and privileges. Though English models are divided into various kinds, yet the modal verbs may indicate certain geographic or epistemic implications that allow the transfer of intended function. Arabic language, on the other hand, does not have such distinctive modals and retains the modal meaning by certain lexical and syntactic constructions, such as nominal expressions, adjectives, prepositional phrases, and particles. Well, the study from that was able to illustrate this, as the English text is loaded with modal verbs, especially shall, in contrast with the Arabic tendency to use the past form yu'ad. which is scattered throughout all of the section dedicated to the punitive provisions, with less references of the verb in the normalized form. وتكون العقوبة the approach and permission are both expressed by the user. Also the modal verb here may, whereas the same functions are rendered in Arabic with the use of the verb يسمع, يجوز, يمكن, and the particle لا. So here it is evident that the Arabic legal language will render the regulatory, permissible, and imperative aspects of the legal discourse through various grammatical and lexical choices, we can say, well, it's lacking of direct modal devices, which is not the case in the English translation version, as it is stuck with only few modal verbs to render these functions. I reiterate my sincere thanks and gratitude to you, in the first place, Dr. Zainab, the head of the translation department, and all thanks also should go to Mr. Dean, and of course all the faculty members of the translation department and organizers of this important event. Thank you for giving me this chance, and I will be happy to answer any queries and questions posed by the courses involved. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for this insightful presentation and ice-breaking ideas about modality and the translation of legal texts. And if you don't mind, we have 10 minutes for questions and comments. So now, if you have any question, please. Dr. Jawad? There is a question from Dr. Jawad Khan. Yes?
Thanks a lot, Dr. Mohammed, for this presentation.
He will pass the question, and then I will deliver it to you.
Yes.
Okay, we are grateful to you, Dr. Mohammed, to have you with us in this conference.
This presentation is a big shift from translation, political discourse analysis, to politics, social research, and linguistics. The title is the concept of alliance with the American political discourse. This unfinished paper. So first of all, we have to have an idea about the concept of alliance. Alliance is association. Alliance is association whereby nations, countries, groups, and people work together for a specific purpose. It is mainly operated in terms of wars. The allied countries are called allies. By the way, alliance is dated back to the days of Benjamin Franklin, who traveled to Paris in 1776 to hammer out an alliance treaty with France, which on its turn provided the US with ammunition, arms, supplies, and naval and transporting support to fight off the British fleet and to support Washington's forces in Virginia. Okay, to keep America safe at home, American leaders after Second World War recognized that threats could be managed outside the American homeland. Could be managed outside the American homeland. Accordingly, they went into a set of alliance treaties, formed alliance treaties. For example, they signed the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949 with Canada and the Western countries, a security treaty with South Korea in 1951, a security treaty with Japan in 1951, and more alliance treaties with other countries. Yes. So this research tries to highlight this concept. The objectives that this study tries to arrive at are two. The first one is to identify the referential strategies used by the former American President Trump while talking about American allies. And the second objective is to uncover the underlying ideologies in the discourse of Trump while referring to the American alliance system. Yes, the study actually adopted WODEX referential strategies 2011. WODEX presented 13 discursive strategies for uncovering or diverging ideologies in discourse. They are collectivization, spatialization, de-spatialization, and culturalization, militarization, economization, somatization, and actionalization. Each discursive strategy involves certain words whereby a researcher can disclose embedded ideologies. Yes. With the help of these discursive strategies, the researcher arrived at certain conclusions. For example, here, one of the important conclusions arrived at is that this discursive strategy was first put by Fairclough and other CDA practitioners. Fairclough talks about them and us. It is fixed discursive strategy. Them is used to refer to the active group, and us is used to refer to the enemy group. Here, in Trump's discourse used them to refer to the allies, to the American allies, to the NATO members, and use us to refer to himself, to this administration. So what's important here to notice is that there is a violation of this rule that is put forward by other CDA practitioners. Okay, this is one of the important conclusions arrived at by the research. The second conclusion is that there is Trump's hegemony over the NATO members. Okay, Trump criticizes the NATO members for not paying to the US for the American defense of their countries. He scolded the NATO members. He criticizes them. He warns them that if they don't pay for the American, they don't pay for America, America will withdraw troops, will decrease troops, and will decrease the military bases. At the same time, he refers to the NATO members as them. At the same time, he refers to Israel as our great friend, and I wanted to democracy in the Middle East. So here, actually, I noticed this use of these two words, friend and ally. Which one is more important for Trump? According to the American politics, ally is more important than friend. But for Trump, friend seems to be more important than ally. Okay, this is one important conclusion that's arrived at in this study. Also, one question that I have thought of while researching, there is strategic defensive treaty between Iraq and to recontextualize the text of Trump, to recontextualize there is a strategic defensive treaty between Iraq and the US in 2011. My question is that I haven't arrived at an answer to this question. Is this treaty, strategic defensive treaty between Iraq and US, which was signed in 2011, is it operative as those treaties between America and the NATO members, between America and Israel, between America and Saudi Arabia? By the way, Israel is not a formal ally. It's a friend. Saudi Arabia is not a formal ally. It's a friend. But with Iraq, there is a strategic defensive treaty. My question is this treaty operative as those with the NATO members and Israel and Saudi Arabia? Actually, I haven't reached any answer to my question, but I'm going to have more research, okay, trying to arrive at a suitable answer without any sense of politicization or political projection or ideological projection. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamid. We may have some questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Ali. You know that your topic is closely related to our field, to translation, because the tools that we use include discourse analysis tools, of course. As far as you have come across the discourse of us versus them, friends and allies. Could you please clarify what kind of vocabulary, grammatical category you have underlined in order to, let's say,
yes, what it proposes 13 descriptive strategies. The strategies I just made.
Today, in today's presentation, I will specifically talk about the rhetorical challenges of the translation of الذي, fun as an example. So before I discuss the translation of fun, the translation strategies followed by the translation of the translated fun as a rhetorical style from Arabic into English, I found it's very significant to talk about Arabic rhetoric and the main categories of Arabic rhetoric. So the first branch of Arabic rhetoric is the branch of meanings, which is in Arabic al-Ma'ani, and this branch consists of amplification, precision, affirmation, the nominal ambiguous sentences, etc. The second branch of Arabic rhetoric is the branch of figures of speech, which is in Arabic al-Bayan, and this includes the simile, metaphor, and metonymy, and that's why it has been translated into English as the branch of figures of speech. And the third branch of Arabic rhetoric, which is in Arabic, yes, in English, can be translated as the branch of embellishment, and one is part of الذي, and this branch of Arabic rhetoric encompasses many rhetorical devices such as fun, antithesis, alliteration, assonance, etc. So the main focus of my research or my presentation today is the translation of fun as one of the rhetorical style existed within the branch of embellishment. of the rhetorical devices in the branch of embellishment. So there are many purposes. One of these purposes is that we employ rhetorical styles within this branch of embellishment in order to beautify the discourse, in order to adorn the discourse, in order to embellish the discourse, whether in the spoken or written language. And this can be achieved by creating the rhythm and rhyme and the musical language that we use as speakers or writers, and also by playing on words. And here I specifically talk about pun, because when we use pun in Arabic is a tawiyah. So when we use pun, we sometimes play on words in order to produce pun in Arabic. So what is the meaning of pun? And how can we employ pun in Arabic? So, generally speaking, in Arabic, pun means that the speaker sometimes use one word with two different senses. The first one is the explicit meaning, and there is a semantic indication within the context, and in most cases, this meaning is not intended by the speaker. The second one is the implied meaning, which is intended by the speaker, and there is no semantic indication within the text. This is the definition by Al-Hashimi in his book, Jawab al-Kalam. So, as far as the meaning of pun in English, it's slightly different, because there are different definitions of pun, and one of these definitions is that pun is words that are similar in form but different in meaning. While in Arabic, pun is one word including two senses. And other writers refer to pun as, they refer to homonymy, phononymy, paronymy, etc. So the meaning of pun is slightly different. In translation, I'm going to give you an example, and I try to translate this example in English, but this example including pun in Arabic. I will discuss what the translation techniques that can be followed by the translator in order to translate pun in English. So, وقالت روح بربك على فؤاد وقلت برشدك أنت روحي. Here, Ruhi is the pun, includes two meanings. The first one is the apparent meaning, which means go away. And the intended, and the semantic indication of the apparent meaning or the surface meaning is the verb ruh. So, ruh. While the implied meaning is the it means in Arabic ruhi, which is my spirit in Arabic. So how can the translator render this rhetorical style in Arabic, which is one word including two meanings? So the first attempt is that, and she said, for your God's sake, go away my heart. And then I said, for your God's sake, you go away. So this is the translation of the surface meaning or the explicit meaning in English. So the translation, the aim of the translation is to convey the apparent meaning. The second one is that she said, for your God's sake, go away my heart. And then I said, for your God's sake, you are my spirit. So this is, here the translator tries, or his aim or her aim is to convey the second meaning, the implied meaning, which is my spirit. And this is the third one, which is the literal translation of the first meaning with footnotes. And I will go back to this translation and comment on it. So this leads me to explain that there are many factors we should take into consideration as translators when we translate pun as a rhetorical rhetorical style from Arabic to English. Now these factors are, what is the purpose of our translations? Is it to convey the formal aspect of the language into English or the content? The second one is the target audience. Who's reading our translation? Is it for children? Is it for adults? Is it for academic people? Is it to translate rhetorically in English or not? The third factor is that the context. Am I translating the text within the context or out of context? Because sometimes our decisions in translation might be different if we are translating within the context or out of context. And even the context sometimes help us to take different decisions in the process of the translation. The third one is, are we translating oral speech or a speech including fun orally or a written text? Because sometimes in the oral communication we have a limited time and space, where in the written context we have, in some cases, enough time and space. And in this case, we might be able to translate the service meaning of the verb and provide a footnote or clarification that there is a second meaning, which is blah blah. Okay? So taking these factors into consideration, we can conclude that there are many or different strategies that we can follow as translators when we translate fun into English. And these strategies can be the literal translation, as we have said or explained in the first translation of the example. Sometimes, because even in English, sometimes we aim to not to translate the implied meaning. So we might decide to just to translate the explicit meaning in English. The second one is the meaning-based translation, which is I call the intended meaning-based translation, which is the translation of the second meaning of fun in English and leaving the first translation. The third one is the translation with footnote or clarification. By this I mean is the translation of the service meaning and providing a footnote explaining that there is a second translation, which means, for example, in my example is my spirit. And the fourth approach is to convey the meaning of the content if possible, because it is really difficult for the translator, for example, to translate one word in English, including two meanings with explicit and implicit meaning. Okay? So back to my example. Sorry. So the first translation can be considered as the literal translation, which is the translation of the apparent meaning of broken, which is go away. The second one is the intended meaning-based translation, which is the translation of the second meaning, my spirit. The third one is the literal translation with footnotes explaining. So the translation of the first meaning provided with a footnote explaining that there is a second meaning, which is my spirit. So to conclude that to translate fun as a rhetorical style into English, especially in English, sometimes they use fun for political purposes, and fun might be used to create humor or for comic purposes. So depending on the factors I have mentioned, there are many translation strategies can be followed in translating fun, and among these techniques are literal translation, translation with footnotes, meaning-based translation, and form and content translation. Thank you.
Any question? Can I تفضل دكتور.
First of all, thank you for this interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. What about context?
Context?
Yes.
Yes, I explained that there are many factors that you can consider as a translator when you translate one from Arabic into English. And one of these factors is context. So from the context, we, as translators, we might take different decisions. And one of the factors is related to if we are translating the text within the context or outside of the context. So if I have, for example, a full text,
Yes.
talking about comic or fun, including comic. So this will help me that this fun is created from yeah. So this will help me to decide as a translator when I translate comic into English. So I will try to create comic in English. Another example is related to political. Sometimes we create fun for political purposes. So in this case, the text will help me. So this will be different if I translate a sentence out of context. So I might not have this ability to
recognize.
to recognize or to reach this conclusion or in deciding my approaches in translation.
It is difficult to
It's
get.
really difficult, yeah. It's really difficult, but in the translation there is nothing impossible. So there are solutions. We as translators, we can take consideration and translate any text from any language.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajab. Thank you, Dr. Ben.
لا فيديو طفيت خلص
The research is entitled The Repercussion of Sectarian Violence in Those Invading Iraq, the Implementation of Tunnel's National Culture Inside Frankenstein in Baghdad. So before I start talking about the claim and the purpose of this study, I just need to give you an idea that the novel itself is Frankenstein, and because there is an original form of this novel that's been already written by the English author Mary Shelley. But of course, this story is different because it depicts a young scientist, and his name is Frankenstein, and that person went through a lot of experiments, and then he turned into a violent person and started to kill everyone around him. So this is the original story, and the story of Frankenstein, the one that's been written by the Iraqi writer Frankenstein in Baghdad. This is different because the context is different and the themes is different, so we cannot to some extent say it's an adaptation of the original story. So it's not an adaptation, rather the Iraqi writer chose that name specifically because he wanted to mention the sectarian violence that happened after the invasion of the US troops. So, you must be very well familiar with post-colonial period, unless if you're field in literature. So, post-colonial theory is that when it's a critical approach that focuses on the experience of colonialism on a specific people. So when the colonized come to that people and colonize them, what happened is that a lot of things gonna change, especially the colonial writings, and also the way after the colonial writings, which is the post-colonial writing. So there's a lot of questions concerning the post-colonial, and one of these things is that the question of identity. Because identity is very important, especially when the colonized people are there in a really colonial environment. What will happen to the people specifically after being colonized? And this is, we cannot just link that to Iraq, we can link it to any environment. So it's not specifically in Iraq, there are multiple people are being colonized right now. So the colonization is considered to be as a recent topic as well. So what is my claim and what is my purpose? So by using a colonial lens of national culture. So I'm using Fanon as a theorist. By using him and by using his national culture, which is kind of like an approach that he uses, I want to explain that a Fanonian approach to the project of colonialism, nationalism, evolution of the story, draws the malice of sectarian violence. So he wanted to mention the sectarian violence, and it's very obvious also in the context of post-colonial. So this is Franz Fanon. Franz Fanon is considered to be as one of the philosophers and also one of the critics. And he mentioned a lot of theories, and one of his amazing books is that The Origin of the Earth, in which he was talking about Algeria and the war with the French as well. So there is a lot of things concerning the theory, especially of the national culture. And one of these things is that the routines and the people of the people and how they live within this colonial, let's say, environment itself. And this is what I'm trying to prove, hopefully, in my research. So the analysis. So there are 4 or approximately 3 focal points that Fanon mentioned in his theory, the national culture. He says that when colonialism comes and influences people, they're going to have a cultural constrainment, which means moving away from the culture by devaluing pre-colonial history, and this is exactly what happened in Iraq, and we'll see it also connected to the Muslim law. Then, Fanon mentioned something very important concerning these people's quest for freedom and for a national sentiment, how people will lost their identity, real identity, and how they hopefully were looking for a real identity or a different identity in the sense that colonialism is imposing them to have a different culture. Then, Fanon's suggestion finally is the writing of combat literature. And combat literature is some sort of writing some sort of books, plays, novels that are somehow attached to the heart of the people. And this is exactly what will be seen in Frankenstein and Back. So this is the first point that I highlighted, cultural enslavement by devaluing your pre-colonial history. And Fanon mentions that cultural enslavement is a characteristic of the colonial epoch. Colonialism, he said, that robs the cultural heritage of the colonized, distorted from all aspects. And if we apply this on the text of Frankenstein and Baghdad, we will see that cultural devaluing was represented in first the loss of moral ethics and corruption, and that was very obvious in 2 main characters, Mahmoud Sa'dawi and Faraj in the story. And then the second one, the sectarian violence occurs that happens between Sunni and Shia in the normal Islam. So the second one is the people's quest for freedom and a national view, searching for a national culture. So you might probably wonder, what is a national culture? And what do we mean by a national culture? So the national culture is everything that is connected to the people, their history, their life, anything that they feel themselves to some extent, they have a sense of identity to that land specifically. So how people start to look for the national culture occurs by one of the characters in the novel, his name Hadi al-Attab. He's the person who's going to tell and retell the stories of the past, and for this reason, we will see that narrating the story is kind of some sort of bringing peace to the people and also creating a Frankenstein. So the last point that Franz Fanon mentioned is the combat and the new national reality. To fight for a national culture means, in the first place, to fight for the liberation of the nation. And if we have seen that in Frankenstein and Baghdad, we notice that the word Frankenstein itself, sometimes that creature that was created by combining different sects of old people, it's kind of like, during that time, especially in the novel itself, there was multiple explosions. So how Frankenstein wasn't created by stitching all these parts of different body of people who died explosion. But in the novel itself, you will see that the writer mentioned that the name of the Frankenstein is not Frankenstein, it was referred to as the schismat. And talking about the translation of this word, the schismat, it was translated into English, but its name. So, of course, I'm not going to talk about the translation of text, but still, the schisma is very hard to translate, I do believe, into the other language. And sometimes it was referred to as a Daniel, sometimes referred to as Haga, and then the monster. So, what is it about literature? That literature is the creation of a national culture through the mythical figure of a Frankenstein. So, through using the Frankenstein, a new literature was created. So, the conclusion of my research paper, in the original story, Frankenstein died, but in the story of Afghanistan, Frankenstein is still free, which means that the people of Iraq, especially in Iraq, it's very hard to find their national culture. Why? Because Frankenstein is still free, and this is where Frankenstein also mentioned into the theory. He said that the national culture is something that is hard to accomplish or hard to get, unless a whole body of efforts made by people in the sphere of codes to describe, justify, and praise their actions done. So, finally, the Iraqi request for a national reconciliation can come true after the elimination of a corrupted politician parties. Because imagine if you are living into a colonial environment, and that colonial environment is imposing violence on you. So how does that make you feel? Of course, violence will influence you, and then the only way through which you can get out of this violence is not by curing yourself politically, rather by removing the whole system and changing the whole system of violence into a peace itself. So that's the conclusion of my research, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Noor. It is a very interesting topic because it is closely related to translators also. Because the identity of translators is also questioned after the post-Iraqi invasion. We have less than 10 minutes for questions or comments for Ms. Noor. After that, we will leave the floor to the
board.
Ms. Zainab. We will wrap after Noor. We will finish? Okay. So any other questions? Okay.
Sorry. The closing speech of the conference. Okay?
Okay. Mr. Hashim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noor, for this very interesting subject. This novel by Ahmed Saadai, Frankenstein in Baghdad, was well known, it has readers, in fact. So, yeah, it's good that you have chosen that. In fact, this topic is within what we call, some people call it the conspiracy theory, if we talk about that. In fact, Americans, with the invasion, we call it, came to Iraq just to help us. But at the end of the day, they destroyed us, in fact. They stole our relics, ruins in Mosul, in Ur, and whatever. And this is on purpose. And now we have a book, The Abolition of Iraq, Mahwul Iraq, translated into Arabic. This is the aim. One of it is to destroy the values. Sometimes نشتكي القيم انتهت. This has been done on purpose.
Yes, I mean, like as you have said, a lot of people, when I talk about the post-invasion, a lot of people say, oh, there's a lot of research papers that have been written about this, but the information is still there to nowadays.
Of course.
So that's what the whole project is about.
Colonialism even globalization, it was done on purpose. In America, in the US, we have more than 750 highly advanced research centers. صور بلد 800 مركز بحوث متخصصة في الدراسات السياسية والاستراتيجية. لمن هذه؟ لمن؟ أكثر من 5000 صحيفة يومية تصدر في أمريكا. أكثر من 5000. In some countries we have only 2 newspapers. في أبو ظبي we have one main daily newspaper. بكل الفلوس اللي موجودة بالإمارات. صحيفة واحدة رسمية. In the US we have 5000 daily newspapers. For what? See what happened in Afghanistan and other countries. So it's the national identity that they don't like it. They don't like it. You have money, you are rich. Really, I'm talking about the hidden things inside. This reminds us of Huntington's famous book, Clash of Civilizations. صدام الحضارات وليس تقارب الحضارات. صدام الحضارات. These big civilizations should clash one day, and they are clashing nowadays. Huntington. Very good, you talked about violence. And violence started in Iraq. It will continue, it will never end. And as a good researcher, you know about that.
Yes, this is the conclusion also of the novel, because fragmentation is still there. Fragmentation is the process, it's not the solution, as Sarawi says. It's kind of like a fictional representation of everyone's telling everyone.
Yes.
So that's the main point.
Very good. Even parties you have talked about. In Iraq now, in Libya, if you follow what's going on in Libya, I lived in Libya for 5 years, I know what's going on in Libya. You see, these has been created on purpose by the colonialists. Really. And such type of parties, and to what extent they are working. I agree with you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you, Mr. Pasha. I invite Dr. Jawad and Ms. Professor Zainab to launch the closing ceremony. Thank you so much.
Guest speakers, ladies and gentlemen, general. Good afternoon and welcome again in our first annual conference. After we have covered the items of the conference proceedings, I thank all our guests for joining us in this 2-day conference. Many thanks are due to the 12 hard-working people who spoke or performed as regards their researches in the 2-day conference and answering the questions raised by the audience. I want to thank again the organizers of the conference for their hard efforts done to accomplish it, and I hope that you all have found it a fruitful event as regards the 2-day item of the program. Hopefully and gradually, I hope that we will meet next year in our 2nd annual conference. Now we will state the recommendations on the basis of the 2-day proceedings of the conference, and hopefully we will take all of them into consideration. Number 1, it is noticed that the conference has successfully satisfied its aims and covered all the phases of the dedication. This success motivates us to suggest to repeat the experience next year with the new directions in the area of language and translation. 3, it is noticeable that the translation is widely used and needed. So our work in this direction would help to establish the required professionality and job qualifications. Finally, I want to thank you all for your patience and attending our first annual conference. Thank you again.
والآن نأتي إلى فقرة تسليم الشهادات التقديرية. أولاً نتفضل زينب.